TTT Studio is an online cafe where we discuss emergent theories of reality with a special focus on speculative realism and flat ontologies. We are also focused on developing our own flat ontology with a relational twist that is dubbed simply TTT. In TTT Studio, we navigate the possibilities for a relational ontology based on a dialogue guided by literal things presented each week by one of the participants. The things presented will be available in a picture shown on the left side of the screen. In the description, you can also find an introduction to the main concepts of TTT. In today's session, Georgia will present some things that show how bodies are intertwined with their environment.
So basically, this image is I borrow it from the work of an artist that actually Gonzalo showed me, called Mary Magic. She was in residency at the MIT Media Lab. Now she's not there anymore, but she's still working on her projects, which are all related with hormones and let's say the ecology of hormones. So this is a project of her called Genital Panic, and in which she starts from this. There were a couple of papers pointing out that especially atrazine, but also other herbicides used in agriculture were having unexpected hormonal effects. In fact, this is what is called sex hormones. So like substances that alter the hormonal system. And obviously they're like dispersed in the environment for other reasons, and then they get back into the cycle and they are let's say absorbed both by humans and non-human animals. So there were this paper linking this anogenital distance, the distance between genitals and the anus, with the absorption of atrazine and other endocrine disruption. I think what is interesting here is that obviously when the paper were published, there was moral, ecological reaction to the thing. But all the point of Mary Magic's installation, which I find interesting for our perspective, is more than this is an example that shows how our bodies are not fixed entities, which are actually constantly shaped and reshaped by being immersed in a series of relations, in this case, ecological relations. But I think that the example of hormones, and that's why I brought this example, it's particularly interesting because hormones are obviously not just, this is just one of the possible examples, but hormones are also secreted by our own body, and especially what is even more important, they exist also as pharmaceuticals that can be like taken on purpose, both on and off prescription to alter our bodies. So I think that it's an interesting example to consider the topic of relationality in general.
And how exactly do these hormones change the way change our bodies?
Well, in this case, in the case of atrazine, well, as you know, I'm not a scientist, so I can't explain you exactly the chemical pathway that is implied. Maybe some of the scientists here can make a small research and illuminate us. But basically, what I understood is that the substance acts as an hormone, like mimic the function of an estrogen, but correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure somebody knows more about it.
There's a very interesting phenomena that came from this substance, which was, and I think that's what led the artist to do this painting. The reason why I know is because I had seen this painting before, this collage, and it's that fact that these conspiracy theorists, fueled a lot by this guy, this very infamous character, Alex Jones. I don't know if you know about him. He's a political commentator from the United States that is very big in conspiracy theories, and they found in a certain in this area of the US where the water was very polluted. What was it? Flint, Michigan, something like that. One of the major compounds in the water was this substance. And if you recall, he has a very famous quote where he's saying, "They're making the frogs gay," and he was referring to the presence of this substance in the water. And I think
I think that's the claw frog paper I was just referring to, right?
yeah. And I think that's why there's this water under it, because the substance is very prevalent in water.
Yeah.
I think the impact of this on water and general endocrine disruptions is kind of interesting. There was a documentary I saw recently that looked at the health of polar bears, and they pick up a lot of the endocrine disruptions in our waste because basically they live off sea life, and a lot of this stuff gets flushed out into the ocean, then ends up impacting things that are sort of on the edge of our experienced ecosystem. So they have birth defects and all sorts of things that come from eating a variety of different sea life and being part of that sort of sea life food chain with lots of these endocrine disruptors inside it. It's kind of interesting.
I have a quick question to come back a bit to philosophy. Because Giorgio was saying this is a nice example of how everything is interrelational and interconnected. But I was thinking this might also be used as a case for what TTT is trying to argue against, which would be reductionism or materialistic reductionism, in which you could say that everything about our existence, the way we interact, the way we behave, the way our bodies behave, can be broken down to these building blocks, which are chemical compounds or hormones or whatever. So for me, it does show, it does point into the direction of relationality, but it can also be misconstrued as reductionism. And my question, I don't know if this makes sense scientifically, but the question would be, what sort of interrelationality should we think of in order to avoid reductionism?
Okay, I think in this case, sort of the standard reductionist or determinist way of thinking about it would be that, like, you know, these endocrine disruptors lead to changes in hormones, which can impact people's biology and behavior, and eventually the way they think about the world and their identity and things like this. But the existence of these chemicals in our ecology also comes from high-level decisions, right? Like it's the choices of governments, the failure of regulation or lack of knowledge and production that leads to these things being diffuse around us and then leading to changes in our biology. So the idea of like a deterministic way of looking at this seems all sort of out of the box, just not very informative. For the direct local causal pathways of what hormones do to which biological pathway and how that impacts the organism going up, that makes sense. But then collections of humans are making decisions that are increasing or decreasing the distribution of these things. So there's upwards and some sort of downwards causation in there.
Mm-hmm. That's a nice example, or your description is a nice way of exemplifying what in TTT stands for situation. Like if you look at the restricted situation of direct hormonal impact on the body and behavior, you might say it's unidirectional and it can be deterministic. But situations are expandable, and because relationalities are endless, you can deepen those situations and expand them to the point in which you see that relations are actually bidirectional and stretch in both directions and across various other situations, like Scott was naming high high-ranking decisions, political phenomena, economical phenomena, and so on and so forth. Because I also assume that this atrazine isn't normally abundant in nature, is it?
Not that I know.
Most likely not. But at the same time, probably the reason why it's acting on our bodies is related to why it's useful as a pesticide. So it means that probably there are analogs of atrazines in the vegetal world, which may or may not have the same effect on our hormonal systems, but at least there must be some sort of homology between what already exists and this molecule, which is very likely a chemical which does not exist or in very small amounts in nature. I don't know for that one in specifics, but it's very unlikely. But also to add on this idea of why this may not be an example of reductionism, I think the one way of responding to this is the amount of factors which may concur to explain the measurement of interest. In that case, an index of feminization, which of course is going to be dependent on hormones and to some extent on these influences, but it's going to be dependent on many other influences. And so I think to claim that reduction has been successful, you will need to prove that a limited number of variables, well-measurable variables, allow you to predict fully the measure of interest. Whatever index of feminization, this distance, or the size of the boobs, or whatever. So, and I think this is never realized. This is something that science has as basically, it might be a goal of science to do so, but it's never an achievement, or almost never an achievement in the case of a biological system.
Do you mean that like the category itself is not reductionist?
So I mean that there is a reductionist activity, which is like science trying to find correlation, trying to predict one thing based on another. But then there is the demonstration that reductionism is a viable way to know about the world. And I don't think that you can claim that this is a viable way to know about the world unless you, or at least it could be argued that you cannot make it an ontology unless you're able to basically reduce the unexplained variance or reduce the amount of things that you do not predict to zero. That's the point. It's like there is a difference between assuming, basically between trying to reduce and thinking that this is at the heart of science to try to reduce and to claim that everything is reducible. So that's the point. I think here you're in front of an example that, yes, okay, science has found to some extent that there is something reducible to the amount of atrazine in the environment, but this will be, what, 5%, 2% of the variance in the distance from scrotum to anus, not more, or I guess this correlation is very small. So this leaves 90, at least 90% of variabilities that you don't explain with your mechanistic chemical model. Right. So this leaves open the room for an infinity of factors, potentially. Even 1% of unexplained variance, in that 1%, you may have an infinity of factors required to really get that 1% explained and right. So as long as you don't fully predict or fully explain, I don't think there is so much of a threat of this type of examples being, an illustration of the success of reductionism. Yeah. It's an illustration of the reductionist enterprise or the reductionist activity, but not its success.
Almost of its failure, right? Like the person who developed atrazine as a pesticide probably just looked at like, what is atrazine's predictive effect on getting rid of pests?
Exactly. Yeah, you could also see it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, but they got rid of pests. That's fantastic. And then didn't notice that it may or may not have been affecting frogs and humans and posing as a potent endocrine disruptor, which is sort of like this is one of the more general problems of being heavily reductionist, is that it leads to a certain tunnel vision in which you link very clearly what you're doing in a very local space and then ignore wider effects, right? And that sort of, it's not necessarily a philosophical problem with reductionism, but more of a practical one. Like if you're working on lithium for batteries and you don't happen to know that there's a large supply of lithium in a socialist country in South America, and that can lead to political upheaval. There's all sorts of ways in which understanding very local causal relationships can affect things much more widely by relations that you're not yet aware of, I think, which constantly indicates a failure in reductionism, practically.
But it is also a philosophical issue, and I think the same kind of logic happens in philosophy as well. That you extrapolate something that is more easily accessible in order to give structure and order to an endlessness of the world, right? Like a lot of examples happen when you attach to language too much and you try to make sense of everything that there is based on linguistic constructs, or when you stipulate that the subject, the cognitive subject, and its own relation to itself is the only thing that is immediate accessible to us, and then try to reconstruct how reality behaves from that, which is part of the German idealist project, or any other reductionist behavior, where you take one thing and try to stretch it out until it covers everything. But eventually it will show its weak points and crack.
I think I'm a bit confused about the concept of reductionism. Can we define like how are we using it? Because the paper, I remember who sent it the other day in the group, it was defined as understanding the totality of a system by understanding its parts. And I think, and it was like described as opposed to emergentism, of the idea that there is emergent properties in systems. So I'm not sure if I'm following like, in that sense, like I think we are using it in that way, but also in a different way, like saying that you are not getting all the parts of the system and you're just focusing on one part of the system and trying to explain everything from that part. But maybe it's just my confusion, I don't know.
So to start from the definition you gave, it's being able to reduce everything that is present in a system to the system and to its coherent structure. Right? That would be that would be the ideal of modern philosophy, known as matesis universalis, where just by knowing one part, you can deduce every other part based on one unifying principle. And that one unifying principle or substance can be understood in various manners. But the process by which a multitude of diverse existing things or entities, so the process by which those entities get explained by one privileged entity, is reductionism. But that one privileged entity doesn't have to be material. It can also be understood as a principle, like the principle of causality. Explaining everything through causality is also a sort of reductionism. But so is atomism, where you explain everything as combinations of elementary building blocks of the universe. So it has various shapes and forms.
So in case I understand that it would be, as I think Scott was saying, it would be reductionist to just look at this problem and think about the relation between an agenital distance and atrazine. And it would be more complete to take into consideration the political decisions made atrazine so ubiquitous in nature. But then if you define the system as including the political system that produced atrazine and allowed it, then it's not like you can take that part into consideration as well, but it's still reductionist, no? According to the definition you just gave.
The main part there would be, so it would be reductionist if we were to focus on the completeness of the system. If we were to assume that the system can be completely exhausted by one explication, then that explanation becomes reductionist in nature. But a non-reductionist framework assumes that no system can be completely determined, in kind of in the direction that Roman was saying, because there are always additional factors that can play a role there.
So you could say set up the problem as I want to understand like specifically the relationship between atrazine and anogenital distance, and I don't care about any sociological, political, anthropological, whatever other factors. I just want to understand the measure of balls to anus and atrazine.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you describe that link, that's not reductionist. If you set up the question more specifically, or it's still reductionist?
I wouldn't say it's reductionist unless you say, I'm going to look at this specific issue and then argue that this specific issue can explain everything about a system. And that that system is everything that there needs to be, that there is no other situation or perspective that can play a role.
So it would be, in TTT terms, it would be like you can define a situation in which there is only two things, which is an untitled distance and atrazine, and they only share a bunch of relations, like the endocrine system and the amount of atrazine that you drink or whatever. And then you can fully describe that situation, but you are not reductionist if you remain open to the fact that those things have other relations that may become part of the situation at some point.
Yeah.
But as I listen to Romain, I think when he's talking about reductioning, it's a more methodological, let's call it like that, use of the word. Like the example of what's the name of that substance? Well, I don't care. Astrazine. Like you said, like the science has like the objective of reducing the variance and to explain something. But that is not necessarily reductionism in this other sense, like philosophical sense that I was talking about, but it's like a method to explain a phenomenon. Yeah, so I just wanted like to make these distinctions.
Yeah, it's exactly like this. It's exactly what I meant. And actually there is something which annoys me a lot, is when scientists claim to speak for all scientists and confuse or mix this objective of science, which is somehow an axiom of science. It's like you make the assumption that the world can be seen as a reductionist object, and then you work with this assumption to prove your assumption or to basically substantiate your assumption. But you have scientists who mix basically and are confused and mix the axiom for a fact. And they tell you that the world is working in the way in which it is assumed to work by science. And this is, I think, super obvious, for example, in the work of Dennett on consciousness, who is really, like putting these arguments in a very caricatural way that, science has taught us that the world is all about matter, therefore consciousness is also matter. And this is not what science does. Science starts maybe from the principle that it is the case, but it doesn't prove that it is the case.
But I don't think, I think that's a problem of people who do science, but not necessarily of science, right? Because science emphasizes a lot, at least the way I understand it, is it emphasizes a lot the falsibility of things.
Yeah.
Anything produced in science is never the truth. It's always just a hypothesis.
Yeah.
And also, Romain, given that I'm a big fan of Dennett, I'm going to have to say that I don't think he actually sees it that way. I think he would say, in reply to you, he would say that he would rather build his theory on falsifiable things than on non-falsifiable. That's, I think, the answer he would give you. Therefore, his obsession about matter.
Yeah, but
not that I want to get stuck in a conversation about Dennett, but I think Dennett is ambiguous enough to satisfy both of you. It's not clear whether when he describes consciousness and whether it's something that can be accessed in the case of his theory of heterophenomenology, whether he's saying that that consciousness is fully reducible to matter, or whether if it's not, that we can't touch it. He's very ambiguous as whether his idea of solving consciousness is to sort of sidestep the problem and just point out that there's certain things science can't do. And it's a little bit unclear about exactly what that is. And I think it's interesting how he tends to be very, very clear spoken on free will, yet very weirdly hard to understand on consciousness. And even when he's interviewed by people who study consciousness, he still manages to keep his cards to his chest. So it's not clear whether he really thinks that we are philosophical zombies or if we are experiencing something, or whether experience really is reducible to matter.
And I think that's one of the critiques that people do on him, right? Is that he dodges the question that everyone wants the answer to by being annoyingly close to his chest, which I kind of admire honestly.
And I think the way he approached free will by sort of pointing out the question we're asking is a foolish one works. It works less well with consciousness.
Yeah, but beyond the point of Dennett, I mean, it remains that you have a lot of scientists who rapidly or easily, take positions which explicitly or not, constantly or not, indicate that the science has demonstrated that all there is matter and everything can be reduced to the fundamental laws of physics. And this is
There's sort of the three horsemen of this are the determinism, materialism, and reductionism.
Yeah.
And they're all slightly different, but like, I don't know, in casual conversation, I tend to use them interchangeably. Yeah. So that, like Razvan was saying, reductionism is trying to reduce complex things to one or two more simple things. And then determinism is basically saying that everything that happens now is a result of measurable things in the past. So that cause is a single direction. It normally goes from past to future and from very tiny to quite big. And then there's materialism, which is like, well, yes, both those things are true. And all that stuff comes out of other stuff, which is matter, right? That's sort of the three positions. And that allows people to conduct thought experiments that are absurd. Like, we don't have any free will because if you're a materialist and a determinist and a reductionist, then basically the first time you started existence moving, that's when all the action is. And then everything is just sort of the pedestrian playing out of those initial conditions, and we have no control over it, right? And that's sort of the absurdity that the people who say like science is more important than feelings and stuff often get to. There's this sense in which all of this is epiphenomenal or supervenient on some ancient action, and it's just a very bad basis for really thinking about things. It's almost a way of excusing oneself from the complexity of reality by setting a very boring set of rules.
I think I have a comment to add to that, which I would say this is I would say reductionist approach on this topic, because just because everything is made of whatever elemental things, it doesn't mean that the rules that determine how these things interact or relate with each other are static. And I think that's where I kind of like the ideas of TTT, but also where I have a hard time getting rid of my materialist view, because I don't see it as a necessity that because all things are matter, that all things are explainable, for example, or all things are reducible.
But Tiago, if you talk about these elemental things, matter, are they really elemental? Are they really just uniform dots of matter that coagulate in order to form everything else? Or is it hard to distinguish them or to reduce them to this simplified view that everything there is it's one uniform matter that evolves and shapes and changes and whatever?
That was my point. I'm not attached to it being uniform. I'm attached to it being observable. And for me, that's my definition of matter, is things that are observable.
Can you I have issues with observable because I never understand how scientists use it. What do you mean by
that
it is observable?
in some way, whether it is through relational, right? Observable is in a way relational. Observable is there's between two entities there's interaction.
Okay.
And they can perceive of this interaction.
So
let's put it like that.
So you would say that we can say that everything is interrelated, and that there is no one uniform underlying reality that supports everything that we see or experience or observe.
Well, I am agnostic to that second part. I don't know.
Okay.
I think in a way TTT is very reductionist also. No? It just reduces everything to relations.
Okay.
It's the same as atomism. It's just saying there is this thing that
That's my point, Jaime.
Things are made of this.
I think there's a
That's my
big
point.
there's a big difference between atomism and relationism.
But I think that that difference is very hypothetical. No, it's like in atomism you think or you defend that you can know every part of the thing, and in TTT it's more like relations are infinite, so you can't never fulfill like exhaust a thing. But it's also assuming that it's made up of this thing, this elemental particle. That's a relation.
The relations are interactions.
Huh?
Exactly. Yeah.
Relations are interactions. So reducing the world to, like, I don't know, little atoms or pebbles is quite different from reducing them to interactions.
But
Because
interactions between bundles of interactions.
Yeah.
Because the things are defined as relations also, so it's just a bunch of relations.
But so the emphasis on relation is the emphasis on not being able to pinpoint one precise origin point of anything, right? So by defining everything as relation, you basically take away the possibility of naming or defining anything that is elemental, because a relation is by its definition not elemental. It's torn between various other interactants.
So instead of monads, it's dyads.
No, instead of monads, which are closed, it is an open field of interactions. It's not interaction between poles that already are pre-established and then start interacting. That would be the elemental view. It's the view that there is no thing without relations, nor relations without things. They form together, they evolve, they change, they enter in unexpected events, but you can't set any priority within relations.
Okay, now I understand better. I think that's the crucial point is the hierarchy between those two things. Because of course if there's relations, they have to be between pebbles, right? I mean, they don't have to. They could be between relations, so relations with other relations, but still at some point wouldn't they have to be two pebbles interacting with each other? I guess that's the part what I don't understand.
Well, that's the part where we say we leave it open, right? Because I mean, you also say you're agnostic about the possibility of defining one uniform underlying matter or element. Well, we also can say that relations eventually can get boiled down to two essential things at the beginning of the universe, because it's like, at least logically, it's impossible to think of anything without it being in relation. And it's also impossible of thinking of relations without actually having interactions.
My point is not at the root of the universe. It's if we think about the minimal possible relation. Like, what is it? What is the minimal possible relation?
It's a steady state goo, I guess. Some sort of just constant steady state stuff. So that whenever you shake it, not much happens. Whenever you poke it, not much happens. That it's sort of, most of its relations are kind of neutral and not much happens.
Like a line in space.
Yeah, or just like all just hydrogen, not doing much. I'm not sure how. Just like a big blob of hydrogen sitting there. You know, it's not doing very much. It might bang into each other occasionally, but it doesn't change. Its relations are very simple.
Maybe take like a few, like one minimal relation. Let's go to the elemental level and talk of particles, where you have both behaviors, right? You both have particle behavior and wave behavior. And you don't really distinguish one from the other, or you can separate them. And let's think about in the same way about relations. There are clusters of relations which, under stable conditions, may be seen as elements, but they're indistinguishable from their relations, those elements.
Another version of the of what Razvan is saying. so to address Tiago, Roman, etc. So you'd agree that the physics we're talking about is in practice a system of equations that constitute a theory of what is. So that when we say physics, we're talking about string theory, or we're talking about something else, we're talking about a mathematical description that is said to map to something. And all mathematical descriptions are relational. That's all they are. That is what they are. So anything when you say it's a relational ontology, you cover anything that is described by mathematics.
Thanks.
Can I introduce an example that is
Yeah.
closer to the picture Jojo presented, and maybe it's more close to all of us and not focused on science so much. If we take the example of sex and gender, right? You have let's say three main accounts, two accounts that come from medicine, one more conservative that says sex is just female male. Then you have a more current one which says there's a spectrum of sexuality there that can range from male to female, but that's all there is. And then you have the gender, which says gender is separate from sex. It is related to sex, it can have relations to sex, but it's not the biological sex. Gender is as well roles in society, the way we interact with others, the way we interact with ourselves, we identify ourselves. And within this, I would say the first position is a highly reductionist one. The second is also reductionist, but somehow tries to alleviate that by introducing the spectrum concept. And the gender one is a more open one, or an open one, in which there is no one definitive limitation to how you describe gender.
But the third one introduces gender. So, I mean, it's psychologizing what sex is.
No, gender does not negate the biology of sex. It just says that the biology of sex is not what exhausts sexual and cultural behavior. It does not psychologize sex. Gender distinguishes itself from biological sex.
To add to what you were saying, Razvan, which is to me extremely interesting, which is a lot of people that talk about gender, I would say some of the most progressive people talking about gender, talk about something called the gender abolitionism. This idea that the construct of gender itself is derived from, even if not historically, from the sexes. And it comes in response to this dichotomization that existed of people in society. And people would argue that the construct of gender itself is a reductionism, a form of reduction of people's experience, because as you would say, I think it's infinite, right? Gender it's infinite. So
I agree with that, and I think maybe Roman was trying to point in the same direction, and I don't want to give the sensation that maybe I misformulated your point. But I also try to emphasize that the fact that something reacts to something else, that gender is a reaction to the strict dichotomized sex narrative, doesn't make it reduced to the sex narrative. It is related to it, but it reacts in a manner that tries to open up the dichotomy proposed by the biological sex narrative. And by that, it is also, I mean, historically, you could say gender came after conceptions of sex, and therefore it relies on those. But culturally and socially, the gender concept is a non-causal relation to biological sex, in the sense that it resists it, it reacts to it, and by that it also changes it, the way we perceive biological sex. So it's not. I think this ties well with Giorgio's metaphor that we discussed at the beginning, that you do have these hormones that get you do have this interaction with atrazine that changes certain aspects of your body, but that relation is not uniform or unidirectional. If you expand the focus, there's political, economical, biological schemes at play. And gender tries to show that. Gender says we are not just biological sex. And by that I mean it it is open. And gender theory currently argues for the non-completeness of the gender spectrum.
So what you've just said, I have to do this because what you've just said makes me think that in relation to what Thiago said, that basically right now some advanced thinkers of gender, which I'm completely uninformed about, but think that it's going to be suppressed, maybe deleted by the current movement. And I was indeed in line with this, meaning that if gender is male female, then it's exploding right now, both because of the continuity of biological sex and because of the many factors which affect, for example, our sexual orientation. There are many others, but probably if this continues in 50 years, nobody will speak of gender anymore. I adopt it, but let's say that everyone changed. But what you've said about the openness and this emphasis on openness makes me think that, like in a complex system theory, it's a lot discussed the fact that an open system is a dead system. So it's basically losing its property of being a system. At the moment it opens, it loses its boundary with the rest of the environment. And in a sense, if you start to open gender, maybe you kill gender in a sense. And maybe that's good, because maybe gender is alienating. I don't know. But I think one of the virtues of, let's say, boundaries is that they enable, let's say, integrity or a form of continuity, and you keep on thinking gender because you agree to keep gender as something closed, as something which is defined by a specific set of relationships. As soon as you say gender is any set of relationship, you lose gender. You lose what it means.
I agree, and I think it is useful to have boundaries, but I also think it's useful to properly relate or to properly stand to the way those boundaries function. And by the fact that the boundaries can be opened up doesn't mean that something dies, it just means that it can be revised. And a part of a non-reductionist view is that the framework is self-revisionist. It's open to its own revision. So also the fact that gender theorists argue about the non-plausibility of gender and its revision as getting out of this duality, or getting out of the relation to the biological sex duality, shows its openness to be self-revised. And the same attitude is also, for me, in TTT, that we're open to change. Like, you can change the way any given situation is perceived, or any given situation is open to having its perspective or its observables, or whatever you want to call it, revised or reformed or changed.
But wouldn't you agree that science is also like that?
I do agree. Yes, I do agree.
In physics, for example.
I do agree, and I think it's one of the main cores of science. Like, if you take science, has as principle progress, right? You have an ideal to progress in knowledge and in discovery. But by its own definition, progress is the setting of boundaries only to negate them afterwards. Because if you set an absolute boundary, then you negate the principle of progress, and then you don't do science anymore.
But I'm not sure you need to negate the boundary to progress. So, for example, take a cell which will negate its boundary will be an open cell. and it will be a dead cell. So it means that to be a living cell, able to divide or reproduce or whatever, let's say divide in the case of bacteria, it has to maintain its boundaries and to somehow do all it can to not relate to, let's say, a given set of features of its environment. So, for example, it can want to regulate its acidity. It can want to regulate its charge or this kind of thing. So it's going to try to isolate itself, which doesn't mean that it loses all relationships with the rest of the world. It means that its integrity depends on limiting its relationships with a specific set of all the possible relationships. So I think it doesn't have to be a negation of the boundary. It has to be an adjusted perspective on the boundary. Like what should be interacting, what shouldn't be interacting.
Okay,
I
understand, but at the so I do. Sorry, Scott. Just a short point. So I do agree that for a living, integral thing to continue in that state, it has to adjust its boundaries and not negate them. But the negation of boundaries doesn't have to be excluded from any ontological discourse, because if you exclude the negation of boundary, then you also exclude the death of a given cell, and you exclude from reality, from the description of reality, the reality of death, which is a factual aspect of life. So then I would say that the negation of the boundary of the cell allows the cell, to become something else, to die as a cell, but it's also not taking it out of reality.
If I can add to that also, like sometime before protists became in a particular variety that they ended up being, they didn't, like mitochondria were outside that membrane, right? It's believed the mitochondria were some bacteria that were floating around and they were incorporated into their boundary. So they are changing and including more stuff. And we tend to think of people as having boundaries, like our skin, but it's including many cells within them. This idea that the boundaries are required to define things, but those boundaries are not necessarily natural kinds in themselves, right? Like it's not necessary that those boundaries exist. It's just necessary for purpose.
I have a very, very deep feeling about this, which is the boundaries are discretizations of the distribution of how things actually are, right? So the way I see it, there doesn't have to be any boundaries, but for sure there's a distribution of things, and we, because it's useful, we set our threshold and we say, okay, in 99% of the cases, this thing, it works like this, so that's the boundary of that thing. But I think it would be arrogant to say that the thing is like that. I think it's much fairer to say that statistically, we observe a thing to be like that.
I think this is where, again, you can relate to TTT, Tiago, and like I was emphasizing, boundaries are situational things. Like they don't describe the full reality, ontological reality of the endless things.
Yeah, to amplify that, I think what we're trying to do with TTT is to think in terms of situations and not always talk about expanding or blowing up the situation. We can also talk about that, but what we want to add is this idea that the same things that you see in one situation, say a description of how the cell is working, derived from current evidence and ideas. Any one situation, the things in it can be defined, can also be seen in other situations. And and not just one other situation, but an infinity of situations. That's what gives them our claim that things are infinitely deep. You can see that by saying, okay, I see, say, a person in this situation of biological sex, procreation, but that same person can also be seen in the situation of another act that's somehow related, but is not considered in the biological situation. It's a situational view. So you may display different genders in different situations, some of which have nothing to do with biological sex, and some of which have a lot to do with biological sex. So there's this fluidity. Well, as humans, or as we experience things, we have this fluidity of passing from situation to situation, thinking of things in different ways. So we're incredibly flexible at creating new situations and holding almost incompatible ones in our heads. But we're claiming, TTT is claiming, that's not just the way we look at it. That is the ontological reality, that things are not just one particular situation, i.e. a certain set of particles with a certain set of laws, and everything else is just kind of imaginary. We're saying all those things are real. Each situation is just a partial glimpse onto this more multi-layered reality. I think this thing about cells and membranes is really interesting. I actually think how exactly you want to map that onto thinking about situations is interesting and a little bit complicated. But anyway, that's what I wanted to push is the way that makes sense to think about TTT is not to just grapple with what do you mean an infinite thing and what's a relationship, but to think in terms of situations and the relationships between situations, and what that each situation is a way of describing what's going on, which brings a different set of relationships, a different set of things. And you can always not just change that one, but you can find that there are other ones that you didn't even know about. And every time something new enters, it really doesn't just change the situation like by varying the parameters a little bit and reconfiguring things. It can totally, it can be a complete rupture, which creates a different situation. They can morph, but they also coexist. So we're trying to bring this way of thinking about situations as closed descriptions available to science, available to perception. It's the thing that makes us think that we don't have direct access to reality. We have direct access to situations, whether through science or whether because we see something or whatever it is, we experience situations. And that's not just humans. All things experience different situations because of what they are. The ant experiences the room as a different situation because of its size, etc. So situations are all we have, and we are. It's evident that the same things that we find in one situation also show up in other situations. That all people behave as physical objects with respect to gravity, but people also behave in many ways where gravity has no predictive value whatsoever, because it's a social situation, or it's a situation that we happen to be eukaryotic cells and be susceptible to certain kinds of viruses. And we're just saying that those are all situations that are all found by science, can be described, etc. And no one of them should be considered the primary one, or that all things can somehow ever be recast in terms of any one of those descriptions. So the way we're practicing science is, in fact, to go study different phenomena, to make up new phenomena, to try to find laws that govern those phenomena. And mostly we end up with fields that don't talk to each other. They certainly don't really aspire to, or they don't practically aspire in any real sense to replace themselves by physics. They mostly get out of physics and go into something else because physics is clearly not going to get you to whatever they're interested in. And then, so ironically, maybe TTT is so science friendly that it's saying, yeah, that makes sense. That is the way it should be. That there's many different perspectives on natural phenomena. That there's no one that's ever going to take over all the other ones.
I think in that respect,
I ramble. Please go ahead.
No, I mean, in that this links again to something I was about to say earlier, is that I see really a relationship between TTT and the work of Bourdieu. I'm reading basically these days Bourdieu, and he's insisting a lot on the fact that science is working on social science, of course, but he, in some parts, generalizes it to any type of science, and is basically arguing that science is about building classification systems, and is insisting a lot on the fact that science is blind often to the sociological stakes that there are behind this classification system, meaning that you basically claim that your classification system is the fundamental one as a way to assert or affirm a dominance of your reality, of your truth over other truths, and is basically a lot pointing this blind spot of researchers and sociologists, because he was making a critique of sociology. And I think so what you've just said about the link between TTT and science is exactly a generalization of that viewpoint. It's a way of saying that there are many different ways of classifying the world, and there is not one which is superior to the other for ontological reasons, and that any claim of superiority ultimately is suspicious, you know? So it's
exactly,
yeah.
very, very much exactly.
So
I don't know Bourdieu, but that's exactly the implication.
Yeah,
it's very much this sort of, when we get uncomfortable about reductionism, it's very much that exactly. It's actually what's kind of scary about neuroscience is that neuroscience somehow uses the reductionist favoritism, or I don't know, the privilege of reductionism to come into domains which doesn't necessarily have anything to do much with what we know about the brain, but because the brain is obviously involved in any kind of behavior, the brain, neuroscientists can cover any psychological or sociological or economic or anything they want. And it's only the presumption that all those things will eventually or soon be reduced to dopamine neurons at all that gives neuroscientists any weight. Like,
yeah,
it's incredibly presumptuous.
And if you read Bourdieu, you will you get that this happens because it's nested, embedded into a whole social dynamics, and it's linked to where we stand in terms of socio-cultural category, where we stand in the world, geographically. Like, all of this is goes beyond what neuroscience is. It's actually it's the frame in which neuroscience is given this power, which can be also analyzed, which actually loops back on this interrelationships, because it's not that neuroscience achieves this just by its own virtue of being a science of the brain, which is involved in everything, as you said. It does this because there are other agendas, there are other drives and forces in the social world which leverage neuroscience to promote certain discourse, to defend certain politics, to promote certain view of the world. And yeah, in that sense, it's very similar to what we've been seeing at some point with religion. which used to be, I guess, in many cases, a very intimate mode of relating with reality, which was expanding and generalized to this system regulating and governing all aspects of our lives in a completely unlawful and illegitimate way. And I think neuroscience and science can derive to in the same way. Maybe with internal boundaries, or maybe with, science still has this falsifiability principle, which maybe limits a bit the drift, but yeah.
But we're completely agreeing with that view. Yet at the same time, we don't think that you don't need to take this as okay, science is all secondary to social relations and is all bullshit.
No, not at all.
Which is another example, right? Which is another example of the same thing, which now has reduced all knowledge in science to social power struggles, etc. So that doesn't make any sense. So the ontology that TTT proposes is the thing that we point to reinforce this pluralistic view that says science has its domains. Those are real. Science provides useful facts, useful procedures for example, ameliorating a pandemic. You don't turn to social scientists to debunk scientists when it comes to coming up with a vaccine. You use the vaccine. So the ontology that supports that says, yeah, that science is not bullshit. There is something there described by most scientific domains. Of course, some of them more than others, there's room for improvement, yet not that they're all converging to one superpower. This comes directly out of this idea that you could think of each scientific domain. It's describes a class of situations with a certain set of phenomena or objects, things that exist in those situations, certain sets of relationships. The equations or models or thinking in any discipline tries to describe in that domain the relationships as best it can. If successful, they make predictions within their domains, but the domains are largely isolated, not completely, because things penetrate between domains, and domains have fuzzy boundaries and so on. But there's always another one over there that describes a different set of phenomena, a different set of relations. And moreover, we're trying even to understand where we know there's one domain and another domain, like say behavior and neurophysiology, and we know there's something to do with them, and that's where it gets really fascinating. But the goal is not to replace one domain with another domain. The goal should be that to create new relationships. I like to think of it like to have a dialogue between these domains, where what is the relationship between biology and psychology? It's an interrelationship. We are influenced by our biology. We are influencing our biology. It's a dialogue. Our knowledge of biology now lets us supersede it. And we don't want to, if we erased it, there's nothing, like if you said, if we erase gender, then maybe we lose something. But on the other hand, we're no longer slaves to these things either. We have this possibility of having an interrelationship in which one side is not dominant over or being dominated by the other, but we're having a mutual interaction between these levels, us with our biology, for example.